The wind that moved through the Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1884 was not the kind that bent grass and moved on. It was a scouring, deliberate thing carrying grit and cold from somewhere north of Reason, stripping the last color from the hillsides with the patience of a process that had no opinion about what it destroyed. Marin Calloway stood on the rise of land she now owned, if ownership could describe the relationship between a woman with $4 silver and a steep granite stubbled slope that the rest of Laramie County had collectively decided was worth nothing. And she felt that wind move through her coat as though the coat were decoration rather than protection. Below her in a pen of lashed saplings she had built in 3 hours the morning before 22, sheep stood in a loose cluster, their wool flanks pressing together in a communion of warmth that was already in the first week of October, a matter of survival rather than preference. She had been 20 years old for 6 weeks. She had been without a home for 9 days. The slope her father had deeded her faced south, which was the one accident of generosity in the entire transaction, though. Thomas Calloway had not intended it as generosity. He had intended it as a lesson. The south face meant the thin autumn sun reached it longer than the flat meadowlands below, meant the snow would melt faster. Come March meant the granite outcroppings that made farming impossible also broke the worst of the northwest wind before it reached the hollow, where a person might conceivably make a shelter of some kind. These were things Marin knew because her grandfather Silas had taught her to read a hillside the way other men read a ledger, not for what it declared on the surface, but for what the numbers underneath were actually doing. Silas Calloway had been dead for 3 years. The things he had placed inside his granddaughter's mind were very much alive. Marin did not look at the sheep as livestock, though they were. She looked at them as the arithmetic of her situation made visible and breathing. 20 ewes, 2 rams, all healthy, all young enough to have productive years ahead. Her mother Nora had begun that flock from 4 animals purchased at considerable sacrifice. In 1876, the year Marin was 12, the year Nora had already begun coughing in a way that Thomas pretended not to hear. The flock had been Nora's project, her small economic argument against the uncertainty of ranching on marginal land. When Nora died in the winter of 1878, the sheep passed to Marin without ceremony or discussion, because everyone in the household understood, without saying, that the sheep had always been more Marin's than anyone else's. What Marin had not understood until 9 days ago was that the sheep were the only part of her mother that Thomas had allowed her to keep. The argument about the ham had not been about the ham. This was what she turned over in her mind as the wind pushed at her back and the sheep below shifted against each other with their small, trusting sounds. Lillian Calloway, née Marsh of Cheyenne, had come into the household 14 months ago with a trunk of city clothes opinions about the proper management of a kitchen and a pregnancy she disclosed to Thomas 3 weeks after the wedding, in a conversation Marin was not meant to overhear. Marin had been outside the bedroom door for a reason she no longer remembered, fetching something, checking something. The mundane proximity of a person who lived in a house when she heard Lillian's voice, low but satisfied, and then her father's silence, and then a sound from Thomas Calloway that she had not heard from him since the winter Nora died. A sound of relief so profound it bordered on grief for everything that had preceded it. Marin had stood in the hallway for a long time after that, not moving. She understood then what she had been in that house for the 14 months of Lillian's residence. She had been a reminder, not of anything she had done, but of everything she represented Nora's hands in the way she turned a piece of work. Nora's eyes when she looked at the mountains. Nora's particular silence when she disagreed with something but chose not to spend the breath. Lillian was not a cruel woman. Marin had examined that question with the same methodical honesty she brought to everything, and her conclusion was consistent. Lillian was not cruel. She was simply a woman who needed, for the coherence of her new life, for the child she was carrying to be born into a house that belonged to her, not to the ghost of the woman before her. Thomas had needed the same thing. He just hadn't been able to say it. The argument about the ham had given everyone a reason that was easier to speak aloud. Marin had defended her mother's curing method, salt, heavy, slow, the way Nora had learned it from her own mother in County Clare before the crossing, a method that produced a different flavor than Lillian's preference, but was by no measure inferior, and in defending it had been seen to be defending something larger, which she was. The ultimatum had followed within the hour. Marin had not yielded. She was not built for yielding on questions of substance dressed as questions of preference. Thomas had handed her the deed to the south-facing slope the following morning with the expression of a man performing a surgery he believed was necessary and pointed the direction off his land with a hand that was not entirely steady. She had taken the deed, she had taken the sheep. She had taken the tools that had been Silas's, which Thomas had kept in the barn for 11 years, out of some combination of sentiment and superstition. She had not taken anything that was not unambiguously hers, because she understood, even in that morning's cold fury, that the terms of her departure would become the foundation of whatever she built next. And a foundation laid in resentment was no foundation at all. She had $4 a mattock, a long-handled shovel worn smooth by decades of use, a wheelbarrow with a wheel that squealed on every rotation, like a small animal in mild distress. Her mother's recipe book with the water-damaged corner. On the third page, 2 wool blankets, a change of clothes, a week's worth of dried meat flour, salt, and 22 sheep who did not know anything had changed and were mildly annoyed about the new pen. The problem presented itself with the clarity of mathematics. Winter in this territory was not a season to be managed. It was a force to be survived. Marin had lived her entire life in the shadow of that fact. She had watched her mother stack firewood in configurations that maximized density. She had watched Silas check the joints of the barn each October with the focused attention of a man who understood that the difference between a sealed structure and a drafty one was the difference between animals that lived and animals that didn't. She knew what a Wyoming blizzard did to livestock in the open. She had seen the aftermath once in the winter of 1880 when a rancher named Corrigan, who had arrived from Ohio the previous spring, had not understood what the sky was telling him and had lost 40 head of cattle in a single night. The image of those animals in the gray morning after the particular stillness of frozen things had installed itself in her memory with the permanence of something that carries a lesson you will not need to be taught twice. A barn required lumber, lumber required money. The nearest mill was in Laramie, and the freight cost alone for enough milled planks to shelter 22 animals adequately would consume everything she had 3 times over. She had walked the arithmetic forward and backward in the 9 days since leaving her father's property, and it arrived at the same place each time a timber structure was not possible. Not this season, not with what she had. The conventional response to this arithmetic was to sell the sheep, accept defeat, return to her father's house under whatever terms Lillian set, and wait for circumstances to shift. Marin was aware this was the conventional response. She was also aware that the conventional response would mean the end of the only economic inheritance her mother had managed to leave her, the end of any independent future she might construct, and the end of something less tangible, but no less real. The sense that the knowledge Silas had given her was worth something, that seeing the world the way he had taught her to see it was a tool rather than merely an eccentricity. So she did not entertain the conventional response beyond the time required to understand it fully, and she turned her attention instead to the hillside. Silas had taken her out in November of 1877 on a morning so cold the air itself seemed reluctant to move. She had been 13. They were following a fox's track across a field of crusted snow, and Silas had suddenly stopped pointing with one gnarled finger at a place where the track disappeared into a shadow at the base of a granite outcropping. The entrance to the den was invisible until you were directly in front of it, a narrow gap angled into the rock face, so that the prevailing northwest wind passed entirely over it. Inside, Silas explained the fox slept in a pocket of its own warmth, the stone holding the heat of whatever small fire of life burned in that animal. The earth below the frost line sitting at a temperature that did not vary by more than a few degrees, regardless of what the sky decided to do overhead. That fox isn't fighting the winter. Silas had told her, his voice carrying the particular roughness of a man who had spent decades talking mostly to himself and to landscapes. It isn't building a fortress. It found the one place winter can't reach, and it went there. She had thought about that fox intermittently for 7 years, standing on her slope with the wind at her back and the sheep making their small sounds below. She thought about it with the focused intensity of a person who has just recognized that a memory they have been storing is not a memory at all, but an instruction. There was a second memory. She was 15 and Silas had taken her 20 miles north of the home ranch to a location he had known since his trapping years, where an old line cabin sat half buried in a hillside, its roof a living mat of grass, and its entrance so low you had to duck to enter. Inside, a single tallow lamp revealed a space that was cool in the way of a root cellar but not cold in the way of the outside world. Silas had let her stand in that space for a long time without speaking, letting her sense register what her mind would then work to understand. The walls were packed earth. The floor was packed earth sloped barely perceptibly toward the entrance. The roof was timber framing covered with brushed canvas and 2 feet of living sod. At the far end, a chimney of flat stones mortared with clay and dried grass rose up through the roof and emerged above grade, capped with a piece of tin bent at an angle. "Put your hand to the wall," Silas had said. She did, cool but not frozen, not damp. "The earth below the frost line holds the warmth of the season that just passed," he had told her. "It doesn't forget. Long after the snow comes, the ground 6 feet down still remembers August. You give animals a space where that memory is the temperature they're living in, you've done more for them than any timber barn with gaps in its boards." She had asked about the chimney. Silas had walked to it, placed his palm near the opening at the base where it met the interior wall. A faint movement of air, barely perceptible but present. "Warm, wet air wants to rise," he had said. "You give it a path up and out, it pulls fresh, dry air in from below, from the door crack, from wherever the cold comes from. The animals don't choke. They don't rot from the inside out with wet lungs. The air moves slow, quiet, steady the way good things move." She had filed these observations in the place in her mind where Silas's lessons lived, not labeled as useful or applicable, simply stored with the precision of a person who has been taught that the point of observation is not always immediate. Silas had spent his entire life acting on the belief that the land contained logic and that a person who learned to read that logic was never entirely without resources, regardless of what the surface conditions suggested. Standing on her slope at 20 years old with winter coming, and $4 in her coat pocket, Maren Calloway arrived at the conclusion that she was not going to build on this land. She was going to build into it. She began the survey that same afternoon, moving along the contour of the slope with the unhurried attention of a person doing a thing they will not get a second chance to do correctly. She was looking for 3 things simultaneously: a section of the slope steep enough to allow significant depth of excavation without the roof becoming impossibly thick, or the entrance requiring an approach that would be treacherous in snow. Soil deep enough above the bedrock to excavate the dimensions she needed. A natural feature, a depression, a slight hollow, a change in the drainage pattern that would tell her this particular spot had already been selected by the land itself for the purposes she had in mind. She found it in the late afternoon light when the shadows had lengthened to the point where the terrain read differently than it did at midday, a slight concavity in the slope roughly 40 feet from the granite spine that ran along the ridge where the angle steepened slightly, and the soil was noticeably darker, indicating greater depth and better moisture retention from the seasons. It was a place the winter runoff avoided. The grass there was taller than the grass around it, which meant the root system below was deeper, which meant the soil was not just surface accumulation but genuine depth. She knelt and pushed the mattock handle straight down into the earth. It went 18 inches before meeting significant resistance. She was standing in the place she would make her stand. Virgil Oakes rode past the property line on the second day after she arrived, not stopping, not calling out his horse, picking along the ridge trail that connected his spread to the road south. He was a man of 54, broad across the shoulders, with a face that the Wyoming weather had worked on for 3 decades, until it had achieved a kind of severity that was not unfriendly, but was entirely unambiguous about its experience. He ran the largest sheep operation in the county, 1,200 head, 2 ranch hands, a barn that Maren had heard described as the best-built structure between Laramie and Cheyenne. He did not stop. He looked at the slope at the temporary pen of saplings at Maren standing with the mattock handle in her hands, doing her soil assessment with the expression of a man cataloging a situation he expects to be called upon to respond to later. Then he rode on. His silence was its own statement. She had heard its grammar before. At the trading post 3 days earlier, Constance Faber had given Maren her flour, her salt, and a look of such thorough pity that it had the quality of a verdict. Constance was a woman who managed the social temperature of the small community around Burnt Creek with the attentiveness of someone who believed that information properly circulated was a form of care. The story of Maren Calloway's situation would have reached every household within riding distance before the flour was used. Maren was not naive about this. She had factored the community's foreknowledge into her plan in the same way she factored the weather not as a variable she could control, but as a condition she had to account for. She began the excavation on a morning when the sky was the pale blue of deep cold and the frost on the grass cracked under her boots. She started by cutting sod, not because it was the most urgent task, but because it was the task that done correctly would make everything else possible. The sod on this part of the slope was thick buffalo grass and sage, with root systems woven into a mat that had been building since before anyone now living had been born. She worked the shovel's edge in with a rocking motion that Silas had shown her, the blade nearly perpendicular to the surface, slicing rectangles 12 inches wide and 24 inches long. She pried each one free with the mattock lifting from below rather than tearing from above, so the root system stayed intact. She laid the cut sod grass side up on a flat section of ground upslope in rows, with the care of someone setting out a material they will need in good condition weeks from now. Because she would. These were not the waste product of the excavation. These were the roof. The work consumed the first day entirely, and left her with a cleared rectangle of raw earth the size of a modest room, muscles that had been tested all the way to their limits, and the deep specific satisfaction of a person who has spent a day doing exactly the right thing with total attention. She ate dried meat, drank water from the canteen she kept inside her coat to prevent freezing, and slept in her bedroll under the open sky, with the sheep making their nighttime sounds 15 feet away. On the third day of digging, when the excavation had reached 4 feet in depth, she hit the problem. The mattock struck stone, not the scattered granite she had been encountering in occasional knuckle-sized pieces that simply needed to be extracted, but a continuous resistance that rang through the handle in a way that meant mass, not surface. She cleared the surrounding soil by hand, feeling the shape of it. A single slab of granite roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, sitting at a slight angle in the earth like a sleeping animal. It bisected the planned left wall of the excavation. Blasting it was not an option she had the means to pursue. Digging around it in a way that maintained the structural integrity of the surrounding soil would require redesigning the excavation width. Breaking it manually would take days she could not spare in the window before the ground froze too hard to work. Marin sat on the edge of the excavation for a period she estimated at 20 minutes, looking at the granite slab. Not with frustration. Frustration was a response to things you had expected to go differently, but with the considering attention she would give any problem that had revealed itself as more interesting than it first appeared. The slab's angle was, she realized as she looked at it, not a complication. It was a finished wall. Its upper surface was at roughly the height her left wall needed to be. Its lower edge was planted in soil that would not shift under the weight of a sod roof. It was not in the wrong place. It was already in the right place. She had been planning to build a left wall. The land had already built one for her. She recalculated the interior dimensions around the stone, adjusting the right wall to maintain the 12-foot width, and continued digging. The excavation deepened. The pile of displaced earth beside it grew into a significant mound that she began shaping deliberately, pushing it to the sides rather than behind, instinctively understanding that it would serve as additional insulation banking against the exterior walls once the structure was complete. Virgil Oakes came on the 7th day. She heard his horse on the slope above before she saw him, and she continued working. The rhythm of the mattock and shovel had become her primary sensory experience. The swing and bite and lift as natural as breathing. She was 5 feet down, moving soil into the wheelbarrow with the steady economy of someone who had long since stopped thinking about the individual actions. She heard him rein up at the edge of the excavation, heard the horse shift its weight, heard the long silence of a man taking inventory. She paused, leaning on the shovel handle, and looked up at him. Virgil Oakes looked back down at her with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things that did not survive the winter and has learned not to let that history show too plainly on his face. He dismounted, ground-tied the horse, and came to the edge of the hole. He was quiet for another interval, studying the dimensions, the mound of displaced earth, the rows of cut sod laid carefully upslope. His voice, when it came, was not unkind. "That's a serious amount of digging for a root cellar," Marin explained. She kept it plain, kept it precise, the way Silas had taught her to explain any technical thing, not as a defense, not as an argument, but as the transfer of information from a person who has it to a person who does not. She told Oakes about ground temperature below the frost line, about the thermal mass of packed earth, about the collective body heat of 22 sheep in an enclosed space, about the sod roof as a living insulation layer. She used Silas's phrase, "The earth is a miser. It holds what it has," because it was the most accurate description she had of the principle she was applying. Oakes listened, his head tilted at a slight angle that indicated genuine consideration rather than polite patience. Then he crouched at the edge of the hole, picked up a handful of the excavated soil, felt its texture between his fingers and set it down. He named three problems. He named them in the order of his concern, which Marin noted was also the order of their actual severity. The first was moisture. Earth held damp. Damp combined with enclosed space and animal heat created the conditions for a particular kind of disaster. Not dramatic, not sudden, but thorough. Wool in sustained damp didn't just become uncomfortable. It became a vector for the respiratory infections that killed sheep in the slow, irreversible way that left you counting bodies by January. The second was air quality. 22 animals breathing in a sealed space would deplete oxygen and accumulate carbon dioxide at a rate that would produce lethargy in the animals long before it became fatal. But the lethargy itself suppressed the metabolic activity that generated the heat he imagined she was counting on. The animals would grow, still grow cold, grow sick in a progression that was as predictable as it was preventable if the shelter had the ventilation of a timber barn. A hole in the ground did not breathe. The third was the precedent of conventional wisdom. Every structure built into earth in this territory had attempted to function as a barn and had failed. The soil moved. The drainage was never what you planned. The animals refused to settle. It was a tomb, not a shelter. His second point landed differently than his first and third, because Marin did not have an immediate answer to it. She knew the moisture problem. She had the solution to the moisture problem in her mind, a waterproofing layer between the timber framing and the sod tallow-treated canvas, the same logic Silas had used on the line cabin's roof. She knew the drainage problem, the sloped floor barely perceptible but sufficient. These were solved. But the ventilation was the one element she had not fully resolved. She knew it was necessary. She knew the general principle from Silas's stone chimney. She did not yet know with certainty whether she could build that chimney without materials she did not possess. She did not say any of this to Oakes. She said, "The earth holds what it has, Mr. Oakes. If you give it a reason to hold warmth, it will. I intend to give it that reason." Oakes looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who hears in someone else's words an echo of a confidence he recognizes because he once had it himself before the land educated him. He said that her father had a fine barn. He said that a measure of humility would serve her flock better than a principle. He mounted his horse, looked at her one final time with the flat, sorrowful assessment of a man who has already written the ending, and rode back toward the ridge. The sound of his horse faded. The wind moved through the sage. The excavation was 5 feet deep, and she was standing in it with the shovel in her hands and the specific cold of a problem she had not fully solved sitting in her chest like a stone. She climbed out of the hole. She sat on the edge with her legs hanging down and looked at the sky, which was going the color of pewter in the northwest, in the way that meant the warm days were numbered. She thought about Silas's stone chimney. She thought about the flat creek stones she had seen during her first survey of the property, the way they sat in the streambed, in the particular stratified patterns that meant they would split cleanly if struck at the right angle. She thought about the distance to the creek, the weight of sufficient stone, the fact that her wheelbarrow could make the trip in roughly 40 minutes per load. The problem was soluble. The materials existed on this land. She simply had to get them here, cut them to shape, and build a structure. She had seen built once 14 years ago by a man whose hands she had watched with the unself-conscious attentiveness of a child who does not yet know she is being educated. She went back down into the hole. Agnes Pruitt came on the 14th day. Marin had not met her before, or rather had seen her at the trading post on 2 or 3 occasions, a woman of perhaps 50 with the particular kind of stillness that came not from contentment, but from having made a large number of decisions about what to spend energy on and what to let pass. Agnes had homesteaded 5 miles down Burnt Creek after her husband Robert died in the spring of 1879, working her own land through 5 seasons without visible assistance, and had achieved a reputation in the community that consisted almost entirely of people saying about various things she had done that they would not have believed it possible. She arrived in the mid-afternoon on a horse that moved with the deliberate efficiency of an animal that had learned to conserve itself over long days of work. The excavation was by this point 12 feet wide, 30 feet deep into the hillside, and 7 feet high at the entrance, which Marin had begun framing with the timbers she had been hauling piece by piece from a collapsed line shack 2 miles east. Agnes tied her horse walk to the edge of the excavation and stood there in the way Oakes had stood, assessing, not speaking. Then she looked at the rows of sod, now 17 days old. their grass still green because Marin had been sprinkling them each evening with the last of her daily water ration. She looked at the timber framing. She looked at the mound of displaced earth shaped into banking on either side of the entrance. She looked at Marin, who was on her knees fitting a timber joint at the base of the right wall, and her expression shifted in a way that Marin, looking up, read with precision. Not pity, not doubt, not the particular condescension of someone watching a mistake being made with great effort. Recognition, the expression of someone seeing a thing done in a way that made sense. Agnes unstrapped a cloth bundle from behind her saddle. She held it out. Still warm bread, Marin could smell it from 4 feet away, and the smell reached something in her that she had been keeping compressed since the morning she left her father's property. She did not say thank you in a way that invited sentiment. She said, "That's appreciated." Agnes looked at the entrance frame, at the precisely cut joints at the level Marin had fashioned from a piece of straight timber and a small amount of water in a tin cup. "That cut is straight," Agnes said with a slight motion of her chin toward the right wall. Then she untied her horse, mounted, and rode back down the slope without looking back. Marin stood at the entrance to her excavation in the failing afternoon light, with a loaf of still warm bread in her hands and the cold at her back and the enormous specific weight of the work ahead of her, and felt something settle that she had not known was unsettled. Not courage, she had not lacked courage. Not certainty, she had not lacked certainty either. Something else. The small, irreducible knowledge that one other person had looked at what she was doing, understood it for what it was, and found it worthy. She went back inside the excavation to finish the day's work. The sheep made their evening sounds below. The wind was picking up from the northwest, carrying in it the faint mineral smell of snow that had not yet fallen but was considering its options. The hillside held its silence around her like a thing that was listening. The 18th day of excavation began with a problem that had no elegant solution and required one anyway. Marin had been working the far interior wall, the deepest point of the dugout, 40 feet back from the entrance, where the hillside's mass above her head was at its greatest when the mattock struck the clay layer. Not the scattered clay she had been managing since the first week, pockets of it dispersed through the soil that she had worked around or incorporated into her wall packing as a binding agent. This was a continuous seam running horizontally across the entire back wall, roughly 3 feet below the floor grade she had established, which meant it ran beneath the floor as well. A continuous layer of material that water moved along rather than through, that would collect any moisture entering from above or seeping laterally through the surrounding soil, that would turn her carefully planned floor into a slow, patient swamp the moment the freeze-thaw cycle began working on the hillside in earnest. She set the mattock down. She crouched and ran her fingers along the seam, feeling its width, its density, the particular cold smoothness of it. Clay this deep meant the frost line above it was insulation enough the clay itself wouldn't freeze at this depth, but its drainage properties were the problem. Oakes had named the one she had told him she had solved, the one she had believed she had solved with the slope floor design. The slope floor would move surface water toward the entrance. It would not move water that was rising from below. She sat with the problem for what she permitted herself, a full 10 minutes, not less, because insufficient thinking at this stage would cost her far more time later. Not more, because the days between now and the first hard freeze were not negotiable. The clay seam was continuous. She could not remove it. The excavation was already at its planned depth. She could not seal it from above in any way that would hold through a Wyoming winter. She could, however, exploit the same property that made it a problem. Clay that water moved along rather than through was clay that would move water laterally with reliable predictability. If she cut a narrow trench along the base of each wall following the seam's angle, she could direct that lateral movement toward a single collection point at the lowest corner of the entrance, which was already the lowest point of her slope floor, where she would place a bed of creek gravel 6 inches deep, coarse enough to allow drainage to continue downslope outside the structure. The clay's impermeability became a drainage channel. The problem became the solution, which was a thing Silas had told her happened more often than people expected if they were willing to look at a difficulty from a sufficient number of angles. She spent the next 2 days cutting the drainage trenches. The work was slow, close, uncomfortable, crouching in the confined space at the base of walls that were now solid and packed, using a narrow-bladed tool she fashioned by driving a sharpened iron spike into a wooden handle, salvaged from a broken rake she had found in the line shack debris. The trenches were 4 inches wide, 6 inches deep, following the clay seam precisely. At each corner, she cut a slight deepening to encourage pooling and direction. At the entrance corner, she excavated a small basin 18 inches across, which she would later fill with the creek gravel. It was unglamorous work. It was correct work. There was no audience for it, and it required none. On the 21st day, she made the trip to the creek for stone. The creek that ran half a mile east of her slope was not much of a creek by August, a thin vocal thing moving over a bed of mixed stone, but by mid-October, it had achieved a more serious character, its surface beginning to skin with ice at the edges each night, its deeper channels still moving beneath. The flat stone she needed for the ventilation chimney lay in a section of the bank where the water had over some number of decades stratified the deposits into clean horizontal layers. She could see from 15 feet away that the stone there was the same general type Silas had used in the line cabin chimney, fine-grained, dense splitting along clean planes when struck correctly. She had loaded approximately two-thirds of the first wheelbarrow load when she heard a horse on the bank above her. Agnes Pruitt sat her horse at the creek's edge with the particular quality of stillness that Marin had come to recognize as the woman's default mode of observation. She had been there for some time based on the horse's settled posture. Her eyes moved from Marin to the wheelbarrow to the cut stone laid flat in careful stacks, to the angle of the bank where the stratified deposits were clearest. Then Agnes dismounted without preamble. She tied the horse to a willow branch, came down the bank, crouched beside the stone deposit, examined the layering with one bare hand, and picked up the shaping tool Marin had set down. She turned it in her fingers, understanding its purpose, immediately set it back down in the same orientation, and took out her own folding knife, which had a heavier spine than Marin's tool and would apply more controlled force to the splitting work. They worked the stone for 4 hours without exchanging more than a dozen words, and those words were functional: the angle of a cut, the depth of a seam, the load limit of the wheelbarrow on the slope back up to the dugout. Agnes made 2 trips on horseback carrying stone in her saddlebags, while Marin made 1 trip with the wheelbarrow. By late afternoon, they had more stone than the chimney required sorted by size at the base of the slope. As Agnes remounted to leave, she paused in the way that indicated something was coming that she had been deciding whether to say. Her voice when it came was quieter than her usual register, carrying something that had weight to it beyond the words themselves. My husband Robert worked rock the same way you do reading it before he cut it. He understood the land had already done most of the thinking. He just didn't have enough time left to use what he knew. She rode down the slope before Marin could respond. The late afternoon light lay flat and cold across the territory, and Marin stood with the stone at her feet and understood with a clarity that arrived whole, rather than in pieces, why Agnes had been coming. Not from pity, not from the vague communal obligation that had brought Constance Faber's sorrowful expressions. Agnes was here because she recognized the work, because her husband had known this kind of thinking, this specific manner of reading a problem, through the land's own logic, and had not survived long enough to prove what it could do. Marin was in some way that Agnes had never said directly, finishing an argument Robert Pruitt had not lived to complete. The chimney construction began on the 23rd day. Marin had rebuilt the design 3 times in her mind before touching a stone to mortar, because the chimney was the one element of the dugout where an error in reasoning could not be corrected after the fact. The structure's geometry needed to accomplish several things simultaneously, none of which could be sacrificed for another. The interior opening needed to be positioned at the highest point of the back wall because the warm, wet air she needed to evacuate was less dense than the cooler incoming air and would concentrate near the ceiling. The column needed to rise through the sod roof and extend at least 24 inches above grade level to clear the snow accumulation that would pack against the hillside in a serious storm. The cap needed to shed precipitation without impeding airflow, which meant a geometry that deflected rather than blocked not a flat cover, but an angled one set slightly off-center, so the opening faced downhill away from the prevailing wind direction. The mortar she mixed from the clay she had excavated combined with dry grass she had gathered from the upslope sections of her property where the stems had cured fully in the summer heat. This was not a permanent mortar in the way of lime or Portland cement, but it was a mortar appropriate to the structure's purpose. It would set hard in dry conditions, maintain adhesion under the freeze-thaw pressures of the surrounding soil, because it had the same expansion coefficient as the clay seam. It was chemically similar to and could be repointed in the spring if any section showed movement. She built the chimney from the interior out, each course of stone set with careful attention to the horizontal level, the joints offset from course to course, the interior flue dimension maintained at a consistent 6 inches by 8 inches throughout. She used the smaller stone on the upper courses, where the chimney passed through the sod roof layer, both because smaller stone was easier to work at height and because the reduced weight above the roofline decreased the lever arm stress on the base courses below. The tin cap she fashioned from a piece of roofing material salvaged from the same line shack that had provided her timber. She cut it with a cold chisel, bent it to the required angle over the edge of a flat stone, and secured it to the chimney top with wire, threaded through holes punched in the tin, and wrapped around the uppermost stone course. The angle was 15 degrees off vertical, the opening facing east-southeast downhill, away from the northwest wind that was the dominant force in this territory from November through March. When she finished, she lit a small fire of dry sage at the interior base of the chimney, not enough to produce significant heat, just enough to create a differential temperature that would demonstrate the draft. The smoke rose thinned, moved toward the chimney opening, and disappeared upward. Outside, crouching at the chimney cap, she could feel the exhaust warm, carrying the smell of sage, moving at the gentle, steady rate of a system in equilibrium, rather than the aggressive pull of a fireplace or the dead stillness of a sealed space. She sat back on her heels on the cold hillside above the dugout, looking at the smoke emerging from that small stone column, and felt the particular quality of satisfaction that comes not from completing a task, but from verifying a principle. The air moved. The system worked. Oakes had been right that ventilation was the critical variable, right? That a sealed space would kill the animals right about everything except the conclusion he had drawn from those correct premises, which was that therefore the project was impossible. It was not impossible. It was merely a problem that required solving in the right sequence. Thomas Calloway came on the 26th day. Marin heard the horse before she saw her father, which gave her a moment to settle into herself before he arrived at the excavation's edge. She was on the roof frame at that point, fitting the smaller timber rafters between the ridgepole and the outer wall plates, a task that required both hands, a good sense of balance on a sloped surface, and the ability to not think about the drop. She continued working as he approached, not from rudeness, but because the timber joint she was setting would not hold its position if she released it before the notch was seated. Thomas Calloway, at 51, carried the particular kind of weathering that came from 3 decades of working land that rewarded hard work without ever becoming generous. He was not a tall man, but he held himself with the density of someone who had never once considered what it would feel like to be careless. He stopped at the edge of the excavation, looked down into the completed interior, the packed earth walls, the drainage trenches at their bases, the stone chimney at the far end, the central ridgepole supported by 3 posts, sunk 18 inches into the floor, and was quiet for a length of time that said more than any opening statement he could have chosen. Marin seated the rafter notch, tested it, released her hands, looked at her father. His eyes moved from the chimney to the framing to the drainage trenches visible at the base of the walls, tracing the decisions in the order they had been made, reading the logic of the construction the way a person reads a document. Then, that's how Silas built the shelter for the horses at the North Camp. Winter of '61. The breath went out of Marin with a steadiness that cost her something. It was the first time Thomas had spoken her grandfather's name since the funeral in 1881. It was the first time he had acknowledged in any form that the knowledge she carried had a source, a lineage, a history that predated Lillian's arrival and would outlast it. He did not apologize. She did not expect him to. Thomas Calloway expressed remorse the way the earth expressed its thermal memory, not in statements, only in what it retained, in what it released through the slow work of time. He did not offer to help. She had not asked. But before he turned his horse, he reached into the saddlebag and removed a coil of rope, good hemp rope, knew the kind that cost 60 cents at Faber's trading post, and had a breaking strength adequate for the load-bearing work she still needed to do on the roof framing. He set it on the ground at the edge of the excavation without comment, mounted, and rode back toward the ridge without looking back. Marin climbed down from the roof frame. She picked up the rope, tested its weight, coiled it over her shoulder, and went back to work. She used it the following morning to lash the final rafter sections into position, the hemp's grip in the notched timber joints more reliable than the wire she had been planning to use. Constance Faber had, in the 3 weeks since Marin began her excavation, elevated the story of the Calloway girls' sheep grave to a kind of community narrative that occupied the particular space reserved in isolated territories for tales that were simultaneously cautionary and entertaining. The men at the trading post discussed it with the tone of people observing an outcome they had predicted, which gave their predictions a retroactive authority. They were not quite willing to surrender by investigating whether the outcome had in fact occurred. The women discussed it with more genuine anxiety because most of them had been in positions at one point or another where the difference between their own situation and Marin's was smaller than they preferred to consider. What none of the discussions accounted for was Agnes Pruitt, who said nothing at the trading post about what she had seen at the creek, what she had seen at the dugout on her subsequent visits, what she had understood about the logic of the construction. Agnes was not a woman who participated in community narratives. She was a woman who waited until the evidence was complete before drawing conclusions, and she had learned from long experience that offering evidence prematurely to people who had already reached their conclusions was a waste of everyone's time. Marin knew the community was watching. She also knew that the watching cost her nothing and that the outcome would speak in a register that no amount of prior explanation could have achieved. People saw a hole. They had decided what a hole meant. She let them keep the comfort of that decision because she needed her concentration for the roof. The sod roof was the most physically demanding phase of the construction, and it was the phase that made the problem. Agnes had identified the impossibility of certain tasks when performed by a single person most concrete. Each sod piece weighed between 40 and 50 pounds. The roof required them to be placed on a surface inclined at the angle of the hillside beginning at the lower edge and working upwards so each course overlapped the one below the way. Shingles overlapped, shedding water downhill. This meant carrying each piece up the exterior slope, positioning it precisely without allowing it to slip before its weight was transferred to the pieces below it. Then packing the joints between pieces with loose soil that needed to be tamped firmly to prevent voids that would either collapse under load or allow water infiltration. A person on the roof could place the pieces. A person on the roof could not also hold them in position during placement while tamping the joints of the previously laid course. Myron had been considering the mechanical solution to this problem, a simple wooden guide that would brace each new piece against the previous course during tamping when Agnes appeared at the bottom of the slope on the morning she had planned to begin. Agnes looked at the pile of sod pieces, looked at the roof frame with its waterproof canvas layer stretched and tallow-sealed, looked at Marin standing at the base of the slope with the expression of someone who had just identified the exact boundary of what was possible alone. Her voice carried a tone that was not quite amusement, not quite sympathy, but something calibrated precisely between them. "You'll need someone at the bottom of the ramp. I'll hold. You place." They began at the lower edge. Agnes at the base of the ramp Marin had built from salvaged timber received each sod piece from the ground-level stack, steadied it against her body, and held its lower edge braced, while Marin, working from above, pulled it into final position and tamped the joints of the previous course. The division required no further discussion. Agnes understood load distribution from years of working stone walls on her own property. Marin understood the roof geometry from the mental blueprint she had been refining for weeks. They worked in the particular silence of people whose skills were complementary rather than identical. The first day's work covered the lower third of the roof. The second day covered the middle section. On the third day, working toward the ridge where the angle was steepest and the placements required the most precision, Agnes held a particularly heavy piece braced against her shoulder for nearly 4 minutes, while Marin reworked a joint on the previous course that had opened slightly under the new load. Neither of them commented on this. The joint was fixed. The piece was placed. The course was completed. When the final piece was set at the ridge overlapping the peak by 6 inches on each side, tamped firmly into the clay-grass mortar that would cure hard before the first major snow, Marin stood at the top of the exterior slope and looked at what the structure had become. It had, in the manner of things built correctly, disappeared. The hillside presented itself as a hillside. The subtle convexity of the sod roof blended into the surrounding slope with the naturalness of a geological feature rather than a constructed one. The stone chimney protruded from the grass a few feet uphill from the ridgeline, small, functional, unremarkable. The heavy timber-framed entrance at the base of the slope was the only element that announced human intention, and even it had the quality of something that had been there long enough to belong. The excavated earth banking on either side of the entrance had already begun to grow together at its edges, the grass roots working their slow, persistent chemistry. From the ridge where Oakes had first sat his horse and assessed the situation, the structure was essentially invisible. Agnes stood beside her for a moment, looking at the same view. Then she said in a tone that was quieter than her usual register, Robert would have wanted to see this. Marin did not respond immediately. The wind moved through the sage above them with the sound it made when the temperature was falling, a slightly different register than the summer wind, denser, carrying more of its own weight. She thought about Robert Pruitt working stone at a creek bank somewhere on the other side of the territory, reading the rock before he cut it, carrying in his hands the same understanding of land logic that Silas had carried, that Marin now carried. The chain of knowing that moved through people and outlasted them. He built things that lasted, Marin said. I'll make sure this one does too. Agnes walked down to her horse without further ceremony. The partnership between them had no social form that the community around Burnt Creek would have recognized, no stated terms, no exchange of obligations, no vocabulary for what it was. It was simply two women who understood the same kind of work, and the second had helped the first because the work deserved to be completed. The last week of October arrived with the cold settling in, not gradually, but with the decisiveness of a door closing. The temperature at night dropped to single digits. The creek was no longer skimming ice at its edges. It was freezing to its bed in the shallows, the moving water restricted to a channel down its center that grew narrower each morning. The grass on the hillside went from gold to the particular gray-brown of things that have finished their season and are waiting for the next. Marin moved her supplies into the front section of the dugout, first the 10-foot portion she had partitioned from the main animal space, with a hanging blanket and a timber frame. Her bedroll, her cook-fire materials, her food stores, her tools. The space was tight, honest, and entirely sufficient. The air inside smelled of packed earth, of the clay mortar on the chimney, of the dry grass in the drainage trenches. A smell that was not unpleasant, that had the quality of something old, patient, indifferent to human opinion. She tested the ventilation one more time before bringing the animals in. The draft through the door crack was consistent, cool, dry air moving inward at the bottom of the door gap, while the chimney pulled warm air up from the interior. The system was in equilibrium. The clay mortar on the chimney had cured fully with no cracking visible in the joints. She brought the sheep in on the 29th of October. They did not want to go. This was predictable. Animals accustomed to open air and natural light were not naturally drawn toward a dark opening in the earth, regardless of what waited on the other side of it. The lead ewe, a large, gray-faced animal Marin had named in her own mind as Margaret, after no one in particular, stood at the entrance. For a full 2 minutes, head lowered, nostrils working. The other 21 animals clustered behind her with the compressed energy of a group waiting on a decision. Marin had a small amount of grain saved carefully from the trading post purchase for exactly this moment. She placed a handful just inside the entrance, stepped back and waited. Margaret moved forward. Once the lead ewe crossed the threshold, the others followed with the chain reaction compliance that was sheep's most useful characteristic. Within 10 minutes, all 22 were inside their bodies, filling the main space with a warmth that was immediately physically palpable to Marin standing at the entrance. She checked the ventilation shaft. The draft was unchanged. The added heat from 22 animal bodies was increasing the differential, which was increasing the flow, which was exactly what the design intended. More heat produced more ventilation, which produced more fresh air, which allowed the heat to remain beneficial rather than becoming toxic. The system was self-regulating in the way of good designs, not requiring adjustment, simply responding to conditions. She pulled the heavy plank door closed, dropped the bar into its iron brackets, stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the sounds the animals made as they settled into the new space, the shifting of hooves on the dry grass, bedding the quiet sound of rumination, beginning as the first ewes lay down, the collective exhalation of 22 warm bodies in an enclosed space that was, she now understood, in her body, as well as her mind, genuinely warm. The thermometer she had borrowed from Constance Faber, the only interaction with that woman she had sought since her departure, read 41 degrees Fahrenheit inside the dugout at sunset. The outside air was reading 17. The differential was 24 degrees, achieved with no fire, no fuel, no structure, more sophisticated than packed earthstone sod, and the biological heat of animals doing what animals did without assistance. Breathing, metabolizing, living. The sky 2 days later took on a color that was not weather, but warning. The northwest horizon went the flat gray of hammered lead. The smoke from Marin's small exterior cook fire made in the morning before she moved fully inside refused to rise, hanging at knee height and drifting downhill in a way that meant the atmospheric pressure had dropped to a point where the air itself was declining to carry things upward. The birds that had been present on the slope every day of her work were gone. The creek, what she could see of it from the entrance, had stopped moving entirely. She had filled every container she owned with water the previous day. She had brought in the last of the exterior firewood. She had checked every joint in the doorframe, every seam in the moisture barrier, visible from inside the chimney cap's orientation, the drainage trench at the entrance. She had done everything that could be done in the order it needed to be done without excess and without omission. She brought herself inside. She barred the door. The first sound the blizzard made was the sound of something very large becoming certain of itself, a low-frequency vibration that was less heard than felt building over the course of an hour, from absence to presence, to the sense that the air outside had become a substance with intentions. Then the wind reached its full register, and the sound was not wind anymore, but pressure, a continuous roar that had the quality of something that had been traveling a great distance and had finally arrived at the place it was always going. Inside the hill, Marin listened. The sound came to her through 40 feet of packed earth and 2 feet of living sod as a low, muted vibration present, identifiable, entirely stripped of its power. She could hear what it was. She could not feel what it was doing. The temperature inside had risen to 44 degrees as the storm drove the outside temperature down the differential between earth warmth and outside cold. Working in her favor, the dugout's thermal mass now acting as she had designed it to act. Not fighting the cold, simply refusing to acknowledge it. She sat in her small partitioned space with the tallow lamp burning, listening to the muffled voice of the worst thing Wyoming could produce and understood in her body, the thing her grandfather had spent his life trying to articulate, that the land was not the enemy. The land had never been the enemy. The land was the oldest, most patient, most reliable ally available to anyone willing to learn its language. She had learned it. She was here. The storm had not reached her. The blizzard's first day passed in the manner of something that had decided to be thorough. Marin slept in intervals, waking each time the pressure against the door changed register. Not because she feared the door would fail. She had built the frame and the bar with sufficient over-engineering for exactly this possibility, but because sleep in a crisis was a discipline rather than a surrender. And she had learned from Silas that the body needed to be managed like any other system, given what it required without being given what it merely wanted. She slept 4 hours. Rose moved among the sheep with the tallow lamp held low, checking the animals at the perimeter, first the ones most likely to feel any temperature differential between the dugout's center and its walls. They were settled. The gray-faced lead ewe, Margaret, had positioned herself near the central post in what appeared to be a deliberate choice. The others arranged loosely around her in the pattern that sheep defaulted to when they felt no reason to be otherwise. The thermometer read 43 degrees. Outside, by her estimate from the sound alone, the temperature was somewhere below zero and falling. She rationed the fodder with the precision of a person who had calculated the supply against the likely duration before the storm arrived. Each animal received 3/4 of normal, which was sufficient for maintenance without generating the additional metabolic waste that full feeding would produce in a sealed space. Water from the containers she had filled 2 days prior, slightly above freezing, accepted by the animals without complaint. She moved through the feeding with the economy of someone for whom the tasks were not routine yet, but were becoming so, the repetition of the past weeks having built a physical knowledge in her hands that didn't require her full attention to execute, leaving the upper part of her mind free to monitor, assess, adjust. The ventilation shaft was performing within expected parameters. The draft at the door base was consistent cool, carrying the faint mineral smell of frozen air from outside. The exhaust at the chimney interior opening carried the warm, faintly lanolin-scented air of the animal space upward at a rate she could feel on the back of her raised hand without straining to detect it. The system was in the language Silas would have used, content running at the equilibrium it had been designed for, requiring nothing from her except the continued absence of interference. She went back to her partitioned space, ate a measured portion of dried meat, drank water, trimmed the tallow lamp's wick to conserve fuel, and lay down. The second day arrived without visible evidence of arrival. There was no change in light inside the dugout. The structure had no window by design rather than oversight, because a window was a thermal deficit that served primarily to remind its occupants of conditions they were already aware of and could do nothing about. Marin knew it was morning from the behavior of the sheep, which moved more actively in the hour after dawn, regardless of whether they could see the sky, their circadian rhythms apparently indifferent to the absence of visual confirmation. She had found this quality in livestock before, the way they carried time internally independent of external reference, as though the schedule of the world was written in them rather than read from it. The crisis arrived mid-morning of the second day quietly, the way serious problems often announce themselves not with the drama of an obvious failure, but with a small wrongness that a person paying insufficient attention would have missed entirely. The sheep were restless. Not panicked, not ill, not in the active distress that indicated respiratory compromise, but moving more than they had been moving the animals at the perimeter, shifting inward, several of the ewes lifting their heads in the particular way that indicated their air quality assessment had changed. Marin stood at the partition and observed this for 90 seconds before she identified what had shifted. The draft at the door base, the inward movement of cool, dry air that was the visible proof of the ventilation system's function, was reduced. Not absent, reduced. The chimney was still drawing, but something had partially restricted the intake. She went to the door, lifted the bar, pushed. The door moved 4 inches before meeting resistance. Not the uniform resistance of a sealed snow surface, but the irregular resistance of a drift that had packed unevenly harder at one side than the other, which meant the drift was still building, or had already achieved a configuration that was directing wind pressure asymmetrically against the entrance. The 4-inch gap was enough to confirm 2 things. The intake restriction was the door gap being reduced by snow compaction at the base, where the gap was narrowest and the drift density highest, and the outside world was still entirely white. Still moving, still a thing that had no interest in being over. She did not need the full door open. She needed the gap restored. She used the narrow iron spike tool from the chimney construction work, inserted it through the 4-inch opening at the base of the door, and worked it along the bottom of the frame, breaking up the compacted snow that had sealed the lower gap. This took 11 minutes of close, awkward work in a position that strained her lower back against the door's partial resistance. When the gap was clear, the draft returned immediately. She felt it on her ankles before she had fully straightened the cold air moving inward with the purposeful quality of something that had been waiting for the channel to reopen. The sheep settled within 10 minutes. The restlessness subsided. Margaret lay back down. Marin stood at the door for a moment longer, the 4-inch view of the white outside world visible as a narrow stripe of absolute light that was almost painful after the lamp-lit dimness of the interior. The wind was still moving snow horizontally past the opening. She could not see the chimney from this angle, could not know whether it was clear or partially blocked above, could only infer from the continued draft that the exhaust path remained functional. The inference was supported by the temperature still 42 degrees inside, by the air quality which had returned to its earlier character after the intake was restored by the behavior of 22 animals, who were, she noted with a feeling she chose not to name, yet entirely uncomplicatedly alive. She barred the door. She went back to the partition, sat on her bedroll, looked at the tallow lamp's small flame, and permitted herself for the first and only time in the storm's duration to be frightened. Not of dying, not of losing the sheep, of the proximity. The gap between the outcome she had achieved and the outcome that had nearly replaced it was 11 minutes of work with a spike tool in a cramped doorway. That was the margin. The design had been correct, the construction had been correct, the principle had been correct, and the margin was still 11 minutes. This was the truth about competence that no one who had not built something in a crisis fully understood. Doing the right thing correctly did not eliminate risk. It reduced it to the size of something manageable. That was all. That was, in a Wyoming winter, everything. She slept, she woke, she fed the sheep. She checked the door gap with 2 fingers every 4 hours for the remainder of the storm. It did not require clearing again. The 3rd day passed in the complete silence of a storm that had said everything it had to say. Myron knew it was over before she had any physical evidence of it, in the way she had known the storm was coming before the first flake. Something in the quality of the pressure against the door, the particular absence of the vibration that the wind's force had transmitted through 40 feet of packed earth for the previous 72 hours. The silence was not gradual. It was absolute, arriving between one moment and the next with the completeness of a decision. She waited 2 hours before attempting the door. Partly from caution, partly from an understanding that the storm's cessation did not mean the drift situation had resolved. It meant the drift had achieved its final configuration, which could be worse than anything she had encountered during the storm's duration. She used the time to feed the animals their full morning ration, the first full ration since the storm began, and to eat a proper meal herself. Dried meat biscuit made on the small flat stone she used as a cooking surface over a fire the size of a dinner plate. The first hot food in 3 days, its warmth moving through her with the specific authority of something her body had been waiting for and declining to demand. When she pushed the door, it did not move. She put her full weight behind it, both hands flat on the planks. Her feet braced against the floor and applied steady force rather than impact force, because impact force against a packed snowdrift accomplished nothing except demonstrating that the drift was stronger than a person's shoulder. The door moved a quarter-inch, held, moved another quarter-inch against the resistance of densely packed snow that had over 3 days of wind compression achieved a hardness closer to ice than to powder. She was not alarmed. She had the shovel inside because she had put the shovel inside before barring the door on the storm's first day, because she was a person who thought forward. She began digging from the inside out, working through the door gap, with the shovel blade breaking up the packed snow in sections and pulling the debris back through the gap, with her hands packing it to the sides of the entrance to build a working space. The snow she was moving was dense and heavy. Each shovel load weighed more than the Wyoming powder snow of milder winters, compressed by the wind into something with the structural properties of quarry tailings. It took an hour and 20 minutes. She tracked the time not by a clock, she had no clock, but by the tallow lamp's consumption, which she had calibrated against known intervals over the past weeks. When the door finally swung open fully, the light that entered was so intense after 3 days of lamp dimness that it registered as physical impact rather than illumination, a white total brightness that made her close her eyes for a moment and stand still in the doorway while her vision adjusted. The cold air that moved in was sharp, completely dry, carrying the mineral clarity of an atmosphere that had expelled every particle of moisture it contained in the form of snow and was now simply itself thin, bright cold beyond any temperature that had meaning in words. She stepped out. The world her grandfather had described as the landscape of consequence, the territory after a serious storm, when you learned what the land had decided about everything you had built, presented itself in every direction as a geography she did not recognize. The landmarks she had used daily for 6 weeks were submerged. The creek line was visible only as a slight depression in the continuous white surface, its banks and its sound both gone. The ridge trail where Oakes had first sat his horse was a slight elevation against the sky, its character entirely changed. The sage that had stippled every open slope was buried to its upper stems, creating a texture like the surface of something woven rows of small dark points emerging from the snow at regular intervals. The dugout behind her was a slight mound in the hillside, barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain, the stone chimney protruding above the snow line at the uphill edge of the structure, with a thin thread of vapor rising from it. Warm air from the interior meeting the frozen outside world and condensing visible, persistent, the smallest possible proof of a principle that it held. Marin stood in the snow up to her knees and looked at that vapor for a long time. What she felt was not the triumphant surge she might have imagined feeling during the weeks of labor when the outcome was still theoretical. Triumph implied surprise. She had not been surprised. She had built the thing correctly. She had applied the principle correctly. The principle had worked because true principles did not have exceptions for the difficulty of their circumstances. What she felt was quieter than triumph, more durable, the specific satisfaction of a person who trusted a thing that no one else trusted and was now standing on the other side of the test that had determined which of them was right. She thought briefly about her grandfather, not his instructions, but his face, specifically the expression he had worn at the moment she understood something he had just shown her, the particular quality of that attention, as though watching a match being struck. She thought he knew. He knew what he was giving me. He just could not know when I would need it. She began clearing snow from in front of the entrance to create a working space for the animals. The work was harder than the excavation work had been, heavier. Snow less efficient tool angle, but it had a different character because the thing it was clearing the way toward was already proven. She was not working toward an outcome. She was working in one. Agnes Pruitt arrived before Oakes. She came on snowshoes which she had clearly built or owned before this particular winter, made them necessary moving down the slope from the ridge trail with the unhurried efficiency of a person who had crossed difficult terrain on their own resources, enough times that novelty had long since drained out of the experience. She was carrying something in a cloth bundle across her back, the same configuration as the bread from 6 weeks ago. She stopped at the edge of the cleared area and looked at the 22 sheep that Marin had let out to stand in the winter sunlight, their wool steaming slightly in the cold air. She looked at them for a long interval without speaking. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual economic flatness, replaced by something that had not been present in any of their previous interactions. I lost 4. The barn held, but the corner gap I never fixed. Her hands, which were steady in all other circumstances, moved slightly at her sides, in the involuntary way of someone running a calculation that keeps arriving at the same unbearable answer. Robert always said, fix the thing you can see before you look for the things you can't. Marin did not offer condolence in the form of words which Agnes would not have wanted. She took the cloth bundle from Agnes's back, unwrapped it more, bread still faintly warm from wherever Agnes had made it, before leaving her homestead, set it on the cleared timber framing outside the entrance, and handed Agnes the spare shovel. They worked side by side, clearing snow in silence for an hour. Agnes's 4 animals. Oakes's tally would be worse than that, much worse by the quality of the silence Agnes maintained about it, which said more than specification would have. Somewhere north of them, a family of homesteaders had lost everything she had heard. This piece of news from Agnes in a brief exchange while they worked, and had lost one of their own, in addition a man who had tried to cross the 50 yards between his barn and his house on the second night of the storm because a child inside was crying. 50 yards. The calculus of the storm was specific and irrevocable. Virgil Oakes arrived with 5 men all on snowshoes, coming over the ridge from the northeast in a loose file that had the grim, purposeful quality of people moving toward an expected discovery rather than an uncertain one. Oakes was at the front. He moved with the specific heaviness of a man who had slept poorly for 3 nights and had spent those nights in the company of livestock that were dying at intervals he could calculate but could not stop. He came over the final rise of the ridge and stopped. The scene below him, 22 sheep standing in cleared snow, several lying in the sunlight, the steam of their breath visible in the cold air. Marin working with a shovel at the uphill edge of the cleared area. Agnes standing near the dugout entrance with her arms crossed in the posture of someone who has been expecting exactly this arrival required a longer interval of processing than Oakes's face had been built to conceal. The men behind him stopped when he stopped. Nobody spoke. He came down the slope. The other men followed, none of them finding words either. He walked to the nearest ewe, a young one barely past her first season, who looked at him without concern and crouched beside her, running one hand through her fleece, from the shoulders back in the assessment motion of an experienced stockman checking condition. The wool was clean, the skin below it was dry. The animal was in better condition than several of his own surviving flock. He stood. He looked at Marin across the cleared space, his hat in his hands, the brim rotating slowly between his fingers in the involuntary motion of a man whose hands needed something to do while his mind caught up with what his eyes were reporting. His voice, when it came, was rough in the way of things that have been through weather, all 22. Marin's answer carried no emphasis, no performance of understatement, simply the plainest possible transfer of information between 2 people who were now operating with the same factual baseline, all 22. We were comfortable enough. Oakes turned and looked at the dugout for a long moment, at the mound of the sod roof emerging from the snow at the chimney, with its thread of vapor at the framed entrance, with its heavy door standing open. Then he looked at the 5 men behind him, who were looking at the sheep with the expressions of people revising a conclusion they had stated with confidence in public. He looked back at Marin. His voice dropped to the register that men in this territory reserve for things they meant entirely. I'd like to see inside if you'll allow it. She stepped aside from the entrance without ceremony. Oakes ducked through the low doorway. The 5 men followed in single file. Agnes, who had already been inside multiple times, remained outside with the sheep. The men's voices ceased entirely when they crossed the threshold, the kind of silence that occurred when the sensory experience of a space was sufficiently contrary to expectation that commentary required a delay to formulate. Marin entered last, holding the tallow lamp she had relit before the door clearing began. The interior was what it had been for 3 days. Packed earth walls, the granite slab forming the natural left wall, drainage trenches at the bases running toward the entrance, the timber and sod roof above the central ridgepole on its 3 support posts, the stone chimney at the far end, with its drafts still moving steadily in the cold post-storm air. Oakes moved through the space the way he had assessed the ewe, methodically, with the attention of someone cataloging rather than critiquing. He ran his bare palm along the packed earth of the right wall. Not wet, not frozen. He crouched at the drainage trench, traced it with one finger to the entrance, followed its logic. He stood at the chimney, placed his hand at the base opening, felt the draft on his skin. He looked up through the flue at the circle of cold blue sky visible at the chimney's top. He looked at the sloped floor, barely perceptible, but present, carrying the remaining moisture from the animal's overnight occupation toward the entrance drainage basin. He turned slowly in the center of the space, taking the full inventory. And when he had finished turning, he stood still for a moment, with his hat held at his side, and the particular expression of a man who has been educated by something and has the quality of character to acknowledge it. His voice was quiet enough that only Marin heard it clearly. "I told you this would be a tomb. I named every piece of it wrong." He held her gaze with the directness of a man who understood that an apology without eye contact was not an apology, but a performance of one. 30 years working land in this territory, and I watched an outcome I'd already decided on instead of the principle you were working from. That's not a thing a man should be comfortable saying, but it's what's true. This is the finest piece of building I have ever seen on this land, or any other. The men behind him were quiet, with the particular quality of witnesses rather than bystanders. People who had been present at something that would change the shape of what they thought was possible, and who understood this even before they had the language to describe it. Marin received his words the way she received all information, directly, without deflection, without the performance of modesty that would have diminished both the acknowledgement and the work it acknowledged. She had built the thing. She had built it correctly. His recognition of that was accurate, and accurate things deserve to be accepted accurately. They emerged from the dugout into the brilliant cold. The territory stretched in every direction in its altered configuration, the white sculpted, merciless aftermath of what it had decided to do, indifferent to what it had cost. One of the 5 men, a young ranch hand named Webb, who had not spoken since arriving, stood at the edge of the cleared area, looking at the sheep in a way that contained something beyond assessment. His family had lost most of their small herd. He had ridden here expecting to help bury an outcome. He was standing inside a different story entirely, and his face showed the precise moment when a person stops grieving the fixed past long enough to understand that the future has not yet been settled. Thomas Calloway came a week later. He came alone in the mid-morning when the snow had settled enough that the ridge trail was passable for a horse. He had aged in the way that men aged when a winter had taken more from them than whether 3 of his cattle lost in the first night of the blizzard, the north fence line down in 2 places, the weight of a pregnant wife and the approaching spring sitting on him simultaneously. He was not a broken man. He was a man carrying the specific heaviness of having been wrong about something in a way that cost other things. He looked at the sheep in the pen Marin had reconstructed outside the dugout entrance, the 22 animals moving in the bright, cold air with the absolute aliveness of creatures that had not been touched by the thing that had killed so much around them. He looked at the dugout. He looked at his daughter, who was working at the fence line with the efficiency of someone whose days had purpose rather than agenda. He did not move toward her immediately. He stood with his horse and looked at the whole of it. The slope, the structure, the animals, the cleared area, the work visible in every detail of the setup, and his face carried the expression of a man reading something he had believed was written in one language and was discovering was written in another. A language Nora had known, a language Silas had known, a language that had come to Marin through both of them and that he had not thought to recognize when it was living in his own house. "Lillian asked me to come." His voice was lower than his normal register, carrying the particular difficulty of words that had been rehearsed and were still hard. "She said if the child is a girl, she should know there are women who know how to make something out of what they're given." He paused. "She said that's not something she can teach her. But maybe—" He did not finish the sentence. Thomas Calloway had never been a man who finished certain kinds of sentences. Marin had grown up understanding that his silences were not absences, but weights, the things he could not carry into words, but could not put down either. She set her tools down. She looked at her father across the cleared ground between them with the full clarity of a woman who was not waiting for anything from him anymore. Not apology, not absolution, not the restoration of something that had been lost, because she had long since built what she needed from what she had, which was the only kind of building that lasted. What she felt for him was not warmth, not yet, but it was not cold either. It was something more patient than either. "If it's a girl," Marin said, "name her Nora." Thomas Calloway was quiet for a long moment. The cold air moved between them with the specific patience of things that have waited long enough to no longer need to hurry. Then he nodded once, a small motion that contained more than most men managed with paragraphs, mounted his horse, and rode back toward the ridge. Marin watched him go. Then she picked up her tools and went back to the fence. The Callaway dugout became, in the weeks that followed the storm, the most visited structure in that part of the territory. They came because they had lost things they could not afford to lose, because the conventional wisdom had failed them in the specific countable way of dead animals, because they needed to understand how someone had survived what they had not. Oakes organized the first group himself, 3 homesteaders, whose situations were most desperate, whose upcoming spring depended on being able to rebuild what the winter had taken. Marin taught what she knew in the only form she believed teaching worked. She showed the land, named the logic, let the people draw the conclusions that their own observation led them toward. She did not perform the knowledge or display it. She transferred it the way Silas had transferred it to her, with the understanding that knowledge given as performance belongs to the giver, but knowledge given as principle belongs to whoever learns to use it. She charged for her time. Not from greed, she had no particular interest in accumulation for its own sake, but from the conviction that knowledge offered without cost was knowledge received without seriousness. A day of her time cost a specific number of days of labor on her property, or a specific amount in materials she needed, or both. Oakes paid in labor. Webb, the young ranch hand who had stood in the cleared snow with the expression of someone revising the future, paid in fence timber. 2 homesteader families paid in work through the spring, which was how the adjacent parcel came to have a fence line and a root cellar of its own before summer. The spring deed signing was a transaction in Laramie conducted in the office of a property clerk who had seen enough of the territory's reversals to maintain a professional indifference to the human dimensions of land-changing hands. The man selling was moving back east-east, being what Wyoming suggested to people it had taken too much from. He took Marin's offered price without negotiation, which told her the price was fair and that he was finished with the arithmetic of this place. She signed her name on the deed with the pen the clerk provided in the clear, careful script Nora had taught her at the kitchen table in the winters of her childhood, and felt the paper change character under her hand from document to foundation. Agnes Pruitt arrived at the dugout 3 weeks into the thaw, in the way she arrived for all significant matters without announcement and at the moment of her own choosing. She tied her horse walk to where Marin was assessing the sod roof for winter damage. Minimal one section at the uphill edge where the drainage had worked slightly too aggressively and needed replanting and stood below her. The child Agnes had brought was perhaps 8 years old, standing at Agnes's stirrup, with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is the safest default. Her eyes were the gray of winter sky, her hair the color of creek mud, her expression the carefully neutral expression of someone who has been in enough new situations to know that the first few minutes were for assessment rather than reaction. Agnes's voice had its usual economy, but carried beneath it the particular tone of a woman asking for something significant while making it sound like an arrangement. My brother's girl. Her mother didn't make it through the winter. He's in no condition. I can take her through spring, but she needs someone who can show her something useful. Marin came down from the roof, set her tools on the ground, and crouched to the child's eye level. The girl met her gaze without flinching, which was its own kind of information. Marin looked at those gray eyes and saw in them the same quality she recognized from the inside, a person who was watching carefully, storing what was shown, waiting to understand what the available information meant. A person who would, if given the right instruction at the right time, carry something forward that was worth carrying. Do you want to learn how to read the land? Her voice was direct, not gentle in the performed way of people adjusting their register for children, simply honest in the way she was honest with everyone. Not farming, not homesteading, reading the way you read a face, except the land tells the truth every time. The girl looked at the slope at the dugout's half-visible form in the hillside at the sheep in their pen. She looked back at Marin with the expression of someone who has been offered a specific thing rather than a vague reassurance, and who is old enough to know the difference. Yes, the girl said, one word carrying the full weight of a decision made by someone who had been waiting for the right question. Marin stood. She looked at Agnes, who received the look with the slight shift in expression that was for Agnes Pruitt the equivalent of a full smile. The slope held the morning light at its particular angle, the one that Marin had assessed on the first day of her survey as evidence of the land's hidden logic, the south face catching the sun an hour longer than the valley floor. Warming earlier, reading the seasons change before everything around it. The dugout sat in the hillside with the settled quality of something that had always been there. The chimney's thin thread of vapor had ceased with the spring warmth, but the structure itself remained patient, invisible, complete. Silas had taught her that the most durable things were the things that worked with the given rather than against it. That a mind trained to see the land's logic was a tool no one could take from you, regardless of what deed they held on the surface above. The girl followed Marin up the slope, not asking where they were going, trusting that the destination would become clear when they reached it. Below them, the sheep moved in their pen. Above them, the Wyoming sky held its enormous, indifferent blue. Somewhere between the two, in the specific warmth of a south-facing hillside in early spring, a thing that had been given as punishment had become the ground everything else was built on. That was the last lesson. The land did not care what you thought you were being given. It only cared what you were willing to learn from it.